Please welcome Harris Ferris, Executive Director of the Pittsburgh Ballet Theater.
He was named the 2005 MacArthur Fellow. He's a member of President Obama's National Arts Policy Committee and the first president's appointee to the NEA. Dr. Aaron P. Dworkin is the founder and president of the Sphinx Organization, the leading national arts organization that focuses on youth development and diversity in classical music. An author, social entrepreneur, artist citizen, and an avid youth education advocate, he has received extensive national recognition for his vast accomplishments. His memoir, titled Uncommon Rhythm, A Black, White, Jewish, Jehovah's Witness, Irish Catholic, Adoptee's Journey to Leadership, was recently released. A People magazine, Today Show, nightly news feature. He's also been named by Newsweek as 15 people who make America great. He's the recipient of the National Governors Association 2005 Diversity Service to the State Government Award, Detroit Symphony's 2007 Lifetime Achievement Award, the 2003 Michiganian of the Year, and Crane's 40 Under 40. Black Entertainment Television has featured him. History Makers in the Making Award and the AT&T Excellence in Education Award have all been given to him. Dr. Dworkin authored the autographical poetry collection entitled They Said I Wasn't Really Black, as well as a children's book entitled The First Adventure of Chili Peppers. He's a passionate advocate for excellence in music, education, and diversity in the performing arts. Dr. Dworkin has been a frequent keynote speaker and lecturer at numerous national conferences, including the Aspen Ideas Festival, Chautauqua, and many national service organizations. A lifetime musician, he's an accomplished acoustic and electric violinist, and he's a spoken word and visual artist. He has strong interest in politics, world history, and issues of economic and social justice. In addition to various genres of music, he enjoys travel and culinary arts. Please help me welcome Dr. Aaron Dworkin. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Harris. Let's see, I think I have a lav mic on, so I'll just do that. Amy and everyone here at Dance USA. You know, I usually like to just start with a little bit of art making. So wanted to start with a clip that is actually from, and are you guys getting any feedback from my mic at all? No? Good, great. Hearing well. This is from a well-known collaboration that I'm sure a number of you have seen between Yo-Yo Ma and Little Buck. And I actually had the honor of being able to recite an excerpt from my children's book, Performing with Little Buck and Yo-Yo, at an art strike in Chicago, which was facilitated by the great Damian Wetzel, who also facilitated the performance you're going to see. And I like this particular video because it not only captures the excellence of their artistry, but it highlights it in a setting that we all too often in the arts shy away from. And that is that with which we're uncomfortable with. I wonder how many classical string players really like to perform outside, aside from all of the logistical issues with your instrument. Acoustics, all these other issues. How many dancers like to perform on stone slab with benches or potted plants in the way? The deepest defeat suffered by human beings is constituted by the difference between what one was capable of becoming and what one has in fact become. Ashley Montagu was one of the great humanists and intellectuals of our time whose research and writings helped launch or contribute to significant social movements, including the emancipation of the disabled through his book, The Elephant Man, and the women's movement through his book, The Natural Superiority of Women. And when I hear his words, I think to myself, what shall I consider of those like young little Buck, who went from the streets of Memphis to mastering the dance art of Dworkin and dancing at the Super Bowl, touring with Madonna, and performing with Yo-Yo? Or the countless young musicians that we work with at Sphinx, whose accomplishments not only meet expectations, but exceed what anyone might have thought they were capable of. So I have a bit of an unusual history I'm going to kind of mix because I think that it's important to share with you the personal aspects of my life that led me to do the work that I do. And the beginnings probably made it pretty difficult for anyone to determine what I might be capable of becoming. Certainly by any statistical norms, being born a biracial baby on, of all days, September 11th, 1970, to an unwed white Irish Catholic mother and African-American Jehovah's Witness father in a small village outside of Monticello, New York, and being immediately given up for adoption, didn't really set the highest stage for expectations. Unfortunately, interracial marriage was still illegal in several states. And given racial pressures and other societal pressures, my mother was forced to give me up for adoption. I was then adopted at the age of 2 weeks by a white Jewish couple in New York who were originally from Chicago. And they were professors in neuro and behavioral science at Rockefeller. They also had a biological son, my older brother, who is currently a professor in microbiology at Columbia University. And by the age of 13, curiosity had taken hold, and I began what was to become a 2-decade-long journey in search of my birth parents. And for those of you who may not know, it's very difficult for adoptees to find our birth parents. So it's all the more surprising than when, after all of my fruitless efforts, I was reunited with them about 10 years ago at the age of 31. Through, of all things, modern age, a website, adoption.com. Not only were my parents together, but I was to find out that they had eventually married and had another child, my full sister. And we've since had the most amazing relationship. She ended up attending my alma mater, the University of Michigan, which led to the law degree she received from Albany Law, and now she's currently practicing law in New York, where she represents youth offenders, working to impact their lives before they literally become prisoners within a system. So people sometimes ask me why I care so much about diversity and why I do this work that I do, and it's a pretty simple answer. I'm a black, white, Jewish, Irish, Catholic, Jehovah's Witness adoptee who played the violin and had a big afro growing up. So I have no choice but to do this work that I do. So unfortunately, I had a tough rebellion period, and I kind of wanted to share one aspect of this with you before I kind of begin to delve into Sphinx's work. And I struggled for a long time with kind of this realization that I'm not the priority in either of my family's lives. And what I mean by that is that for my adoptive family, my brother's relationship with them was always different. And it was closer than mine was. And I actually spent a significant period of time from the critical ages of about 19 to 24 completely ostracized from them. And that was something that really just never could have occurred with my brother. And in my birth family, my sister, by default, is and must be the priority for my birth family. I've only known them since I was 31 years old. She grew up with them. So I found myself wondering kind of how many others might have experienced this sense of profound loneliness that I often felt. Or as a friend of mine put it, Aaron, it's not loneliness, it's leadership. So I came up with just a little, because I like to, and with our work at Sphinx, and I'll show this to you, that I think it's important anytime you're really looking at something, if you want to be serious about it, you need to quantify it. Even though what's driving it is idealism or a sense of creating maybe even a spiritual change about something, if you don't quantify things and you're not able to measure the impact that you're having, it makes it all too easy to fool yourself into thinking you're doing something or achieving something that you actually aren't. So I came up with just a little thing which was kind of the odds of me, and maybe in the hopes that I might be able to find some support group out there that could help me. So when we actually look at black children adopted into white homes in the United States, it's actually very, very rare. In the entire history of America, less than 12,000 total black children were adopted into white homes before 1975. And the interesting thing that I noted is that in our history, there is only 1 year where the number of interracial adoptions actually doubled, more than doubled, and that was the year in which I was born. So the chances that my life would have unfolded in the weird way that it did, and in the way that it brought so many different cultural aspects to be part of my life, literally needed to occur in that year that I was born. So I kind of went on and I said, okay, well, let me take this kind of total number of babies who were adopted in the country at that time, which is about 1% of all adoptions, which are these interracial adoptions, and kind of get a sense of those who might have had a similar life experience as I did. So it was 40,000, but of course, I'm not looking at all blacks adopted into white homes, because I was adopted into what people refer to as a blended household, which means there are only a quarter of adoptions where someone's actually adopted into a home where there are already birth children, because that creates a different dynamic. There is one child in the home that's the birth child, and then another child that's not. And that's about 25% of homes. So that left me with about 10,000. Then, of course, those adoptees aren't actually reunited with their birth parents. So the adoptees who actually search, surprising to me because I always was driven by it since a very young age, is about 4% who actually search, which left me with about 400, but only 1% of searches actually result in identifying the birth parents of an adoptee, which unfortunately left me with only 4, but when you come to reunifications, it's almost never the case that an adoptee is reunified with birth parents who then actually got together and had another birth child, which brings you back to being back in another blended home, which is a 25%, which is why I wrote a book. And a little bit of a cathartic process for me to be my own self-help support group. So to get back to kind of my educational and musical development, I kind of have a little timeline that, because of the way I talk about it, is not actually in chronological order. So just in case there's it's not in chronological order. When I was 5 years old, my mother, so my adoptive mother, who was an amateur violinist, and she became motivated to play her instrument by Nathan Milstein's recording of the Unaccompanied Bach, an amazing, amazing recording. And her practicing inspired me, and as a result, I took a great interest in the instrument and began vigorously studying. And I was very, very lucky early on to have great teaching. My first teacher was Vladimir Grafman, who's one of the great Russian teachers who really brought the Russian school over to the United States, taught the likes of Joseph Gingold and others, who taught Joshua Bell and many of our other major soloists today. So growing up in New York, the arts simply defined me, and they set the stage for the life that I was to live. And it wasn't just music or the visual art at PS 183, where I attended, but also dance through the early ballet classes that I took, going downtown with my Capezio bag and working hard on my fifth position, which I must say to this day, my turnout is really, really awesome. But unfortunately, though my progression with dance has only led to no professional opportunities, but I did have a little stint on the Ann Arbor Dancing with the Stars, which I figured I might just share a little clip. Like the white bow tie So I really, now that I actually shared that, I feel really, really bad that I did that. I thought I would share something there. But anyway, I remember sitting in Carnegie Hall when I was 8 years old, listening to Isaac Stern perform, and the impact that experience had on me, and this sense of awe that it built in me in music that has stayed with me all of these years. However, I don't recollect around the same time seeing Sanford Allen. And of course, who, you might ask, is Sanford Allen? Well, in 1961, this young man sat on the stage of Carnegie Hall as not only the first black member of the New York Philharmonic in the orchestra's history, but as the first full-time African-American member of a major American orchestra. And more on some aspects associated to that in a few minutes. So when I was 10 years old, my family moved from Manhattan to Hershey, Pennsylvania, a drastic social change for me, moving from the world's great metropolis to a town which at the time had only one black family in the school district. So after beginning my studies with Grafman in the 92nd Street Y in New York, I continued developing on my instrument through Peabody Prep in Baltimore, and I served as concertmaster of the Harrisburg Youth Symphony. And I then spent my junior and senior years of high school at the Interlochen Arts Academy in Michigan, and after Interlochen, I began my tenure as a college student at Penn State, where I was concertmaster of the Penn State Philharmonic, and then went on to complete my degrees, bachelor's and master's, at the University of Michigan. And in all of those musical environments, I was either the only or one of less than a handful of minorities. And also, interestingly enough, it wasn't until I was working on my degrees at the University of Michigan that I first learned that there were any black composers. I literally went into a lesson one day and my teacher said, would you like to play music by black composers? And I was actually a little bit put off. I said, I'm a serious musician. Do you mean jazz or, something like that? Like what? And he kind of smiled and he starts to pull these volumes of works off of his shelves. And this led to an incredible expansion of the music that I performed as I focused on the works by blacks and Latinos during my undergraduate and graduate recitals. And it led me to question, why had no one told me about William Grant Still, Coleridge Taylor Perkinson, David Baker, Joseph Boulogne St. George, an Afro-French contemporary of Mozart's, or the countless other minority composers whose accomplishments litter the annals of the classical music repertory? Why had no one told me about George Polgreen Bridgetower, a well-known black violin virtuoso who was good friends with Beethoven and premiered his famous Kreutzer Sonata with him in 1803 in Vienna, and for whom Beethoven wrote the work, which is why when you go to the original manuscript, it says Sonata Mulatica Composto per il Mulatto. And most violinists who perform it aren't even aware of that. And interestingly enough, they actually had a falling out over a woman. And so Beethoven changed the inscription, and even though it then became attributed to Kreutzer, Kreutzer never performed the work ever in public. Why had no one told me that the great Frederick Douglass played the violin, or that his grandson Joseph Douglass was the first black violinist to tour the United States as a recitalist in the early 1900s? And this same story of the lack of awareness of all of the voices that have contributed to our disciplines can be told across the spectrum of the arts. In dance, why are there so many who know so little of the legacy of Maria Tallchief, the first Native American prima ballerina of the New York City Ballet? Or the stories of the American Negro Ballet, founded in 1937, or the first Negro classic ballet, founded by Joseph Rickard, whose first recital was in 1947, both of which helped provide the foundation from which Dance Theater of Harlem, Alvin Ailey, and many, many others would not have been possible. And what about the many dancers of today, including Joan Myers-Brown and Philadenko, who's here and of course will be honored, and I'm honored to be able to share the same venue and space. And so it was within the context of these questions and immersion in the incredible music which I had recently been exposed to, combined with the lack of minorities that I would see in audiences or on stage, that led me to founding the Sphinx Organization, where I literally went into a lesson one day with my teacher, Steve Ships, and said, I've got this idea. And it was also at this time that I began to reflect on all the feedback that I received as I was growing up from peers or from others that sought to distance me from my own cultural heritage because of my development and my work and my talent on the violin. And that actually led me to writing the title poem for my book of poetry that I wanted to share with you, which is entitled, They Said I Wasn't Really Black. Born from white and brown young skins, I was so different from the pack. Adopted by Caucasians at just 2 weeks of age. They couldn't have known about the other people. They said I wasn't really black. A violinist I was destined for early on, I showed them the knack. It was Mozart for me and Beethoven too. I never got to memorize Jackson 5 lyrics, so they said I wasn't really black. School bells and cafeteria food, I sat there with my brown lunch sack. There was no fried chicken in my Ziploc bag, no confrontation between watermelon and black-eyed peas. They said I wasn't really black. I'd stroll into the rehearsal room wishing I was the Daddy Mac. I didn't even go to the games, let alone sport the jersey. Hell, I wasn't even in the band, and I wonder why they said I wasn't really black. I didn't talk the talk and couldn't walk the walk. Familial precedent I did lack. At first it seemed correct by design. It took me years till I was uncomfortable when they said I wasn't really black. There were those who made me feel different and a few who I thought had my back. I could have taken all the racial slurs if only it wasn't my friends around when they said I wasn't really black. All I sought was acceptance, any click shell I could not crack. They feared the anomaly, too bad for me that I got good grades, couldn't play spades because they said I wasn't really black. And then it settled down on me, waiting unease upon my back. Like the line and rhyme of these words I write, I had only just begun to fight when they said I wasn't really black. The first African queen I was to know drew me in like the sweet lilac. She shut those doors, supposedly wanted more, but I knew the reason behind, because they said I wasn't really black. For a time I had an afro. It should have got me on the track. Foolish me to think they'd see what I wanted to be. Why did they all have to agree? My skin was just a racial gee. Hopelessly, eventually, they said I wasn't really black. I'm glad I found out that they were wrong. I ain't born in Uncle Tom's shack. I guess they wish the color was not what it is, but what they wanted it to be when they said I wasn't really black. I have come to terms with what I cannot fight. I yearn no longer to attack. The title I sought without emerged from within. There was serenity and complacency while impervious to chagrin when they said I wasn't really black. Every moment I burst with pride. I toss a memory in my sack. Their jibes ebb like the tide as I open the floodgates wide. It was quite a ride. Over now, save the rare aside. I wish I wouldn't have cried. I kind of hope they lied when they said I wasn't really black. So if today I'm to not only share So if today I'm to not only share with you the work that we do, but also provide some background for why this work that we do is so critically important and what the issues are of overcoming the challenges of achieving diversity in the arts, then we must have some context in which to present those ideas, a sense of where are we at now? Where do we want to move from here? And these slides that I'm going to utilize reference classical music. And the reason for that is that unfortunately most of our other disciplines, including dance, don't track this information. So we see there are similar and sometimes lesser numbers in many of the other art forms, but at least the numbers that we have in classical music at least give a sense for us of what I like to refer to as the state of the field. So I'll go through a few of these, and then I have a short kind of 5-minute overview video that will give you a sense of how Sphinx is tackling some of these, which hopefully will spur some ideas within the dance field itself. So when we look at orchestras, no big surprise, there is very little diversity. They're a little less than 2% black, a little more than 2% Latino, and Asian Americans represent a little over 7%. When we look at that, though, it's important to say, okay, these are smaller numbers, but let's look at the overall population. So we see, of course, with blacks and Latinos, dramatic underrepresentation. And one of the questions that people have often asked me is they say, oh, well, Sphinx is focused on diversity. Why do you not focus on Asian Americans, say, with your national competition that we have? And that's because our goal is to build diversity. I never looked at, when I founded Sphinx, as it being an affirmative action mechanism. I did not want to have a program that was designed to uplift a specific cultural group or underrepresented group. I wanted to build diversity in an art form that I felt passionately about, both for reasons of community, for society, but most of all what drove me was my art form. I felt that our art forms suffer when we do not bring all of the voices in and we don't provide for that ability to evolve this incredible way to reflect ourselves to others. And so from a structural mechanism, Sphinx therefore wanted to focus on the most underrepresented groups within classical music, which of course were blacks and Latinos. Asian Americans are actually overrepresented. Again, intuitive, but that's why our focus for our national competition and some of our other programs specifically focus on blacks and Latinos. So orchestras, we can see that, and of course on stage there's very little diversity, but there's many other components of our artistic institutions. So it's important to look at these and see what is actually going on. And again, we see these numbers mirrored or less across all of the disciplines. But for America's orchestras, less than 0.5% of executive directors are black, less than 1% are Latino. When we go to music directors, conductors, here we see only about 2% are black, a little less than 2% Latino. When we look at education and community relation directors, so here is the key position that is the tie to faith-based institutions, to the educational systems, to the school districts, where you would think a lot of orchestras would place minority staff. There still is only 3% black and 2% Hispanic or Latino. And artistic administrators, so other than the music director, the person determining run-out concerts, repertoire, guest conductors, a host of different activities across America's 1,200 orchestras, statistically 0% are black or Latino. To give you an idea of some of the anecdotes, as I mentioned, Sanford Allen joined the New York Philharmonic back in the 1960s. Today, the New York Philharmonic has no African American members. So looking in a little more, that's kind of a sense of the staffing, human resources, but what are we performing? What's the repertoire? And obviously we can see similar things when we look at choreography. But no big surprise, you take the top 10 composers, 0% are black or Latino, but we're also performing very few North American composers. So it's important to actually pull out and say, well, what if we just take the overall top 10 composers that are only from North American composers? We still represent less than 1%. So if Sphinx had as our milestone goal to have 1%, just 1% of the works performed by American orchestras be those by any composer of color, we have yet to, after 16 years, reach that milestone. Audiences, so who's actually sitting in the audience? Well, interestingly enough, while it is small, blacks being 4%, Hispanics being 6%, it is actually close to double the representation in the orchestra itself, which is an interesting thing to note. I won't go into all of the details of this graph, but just to give you a sense that this is giving us a sense of what will happen, and this is a study conducted by the League of American Orchestras, and basically we find that we are going to have a significant loss over the next 10 years in terms of audiences, about 14% or 3 million. And of course the majority of those losses will be among whites because whites present the majority of the audiences. But the interesting thing looking forward is that there will be an increase in audiences. And that largest increase will be in among Latino audiences, but overall audiences of color, specifically a growth of over 1 million. And the conclusion of the League's own study, not the Sphinx study, was that, quote, non-white minorities will drive the vast majority of new gains in classical music. So those institutions which are prepared, which are engaging these communities, are the ones which will move forward and not just survive, but will thrive. And we've all, of course, heard the nightmare stories of many orchestras, big and small, that the challenges that they're facing these days. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly because I know I'm preaching to the choir when it comes to arts education. The overall summary is, of course, arts education affects everything about someone's life. It affects their postgraduate degrees, where 88% had arts. It affects their overall income for those who earn over $150,000. When you look at SAT scores, on average, they're about 20 to 30 points higher for math and writing if students had arts in school. And for those that didn't have a program, arts program, those numbers are lower. And the President's Committee on Arts and Humanities has also had a wonderful program nationally where they've specifically targeted underserved schools, and they're already seeing the impact when they go to some of the toughest, hardest hit schools, like in New Orleans and other areas, and bring the arts. It transforms young people's ability. and their overall achievement. And one of the key kind of conclusions is that at-risk youth with history of intensive arts experience, so not just cursory kind of one-stop shop, but intensive arts experiences show achievement levels that close to or exceed those who are not at risk. So with that kind of sense of the context, hopefully that provides a background for the reasons for why I felt that the mission of the Sphinx Organization was necessary and the scope of the programming that we do. And this is about a 5-minute video that will give you that sense so that you don't just have to sit and hear me tell you about our different program areas. So this is the work of Sphinx.
I may be only 15 years old, but already the Sphinx Organization has changed my life. I'm Randall Gooseby, and I was fortunate to be the 2010 Junior Division First Place Laureate of the annual Sphinx competition.
In literally all of the musical environments that I found myself in, from starting the violin at the age of 5, all the way up through working on my degrees at the University of Michigan, I was the only minority, or maybe one of less than a handful. In addition, anytime I'd go to an orchestra concert, I'd look on stage, I'd look around me in the audience, and wonder, why is there no one who looks like me?
That all began to change when Aaron created the Sphinx Organization in 1997. At that time, only about 1.5% of orchestras were Black or Latino. Today, thanks to Sphinx, that number has more than doubled. The earliest alums grew out of the first Sphinx competition, the flagship event of the Sphinx Organization.
The level of talent is wonderfully high, and I've heard some first-class young players who are destined to go far in the field.
They are accompanied by the remarkable Sphinx Symphony Orchestra, the first and only professional Black and Latino orchestra in the world. Sphinx supports its participants in many ways.
Our artists have gone on to bring incredible contributions to our field. Every year in our nation's capital, we celebrate extraordinary musicians of color with the highest honor that Sphinx bestows, our Medals of Excellence.
Laureates perform as solos with major orchestras, and through the creation of new and exciting chamber ensembles, Sphinx is introducing its talented alumni to the world.
And let your ear be your guide. I think the Sphinx Organization is so incredibly important. What I love about this organization is that it tries to achieve in our society an equilibrium of people who are incredibly talented and motivated to be part of every aspect of our society, including musical society. Talent does not pick demographics.
We've been able to have a tremendous impact here in the United States. And as we looked at some of the opportunities for our artists, we began to even look across the seas and abroad.
Sphinx UK is Southbank Centre's first international partner. As we've looked abroad at various potential partners, it all comes down to 3 or 4 great projects around the world, of which Sphinx is one.
This kind of change starts with education, a critical part of everything Sphinx does.
So many studies really advocate for arts education, music education in school because of the positive effect that it has on academic achievement and scholastic aptitude. The arts are great for them. They spark intellectual curiosity and they spark creativity. With that in mind, Sphinx has created Sphinx Stars, a competition to showcase Detroit's greatest talents in all musical genres and cultural backgrounds.
The Sphinx Overture program introduces young people in underserved communities to violin performance. Instrument usage and lessons are provided free of charge. Helping to further those dreams, the Sphinx Performance Academy provides an intensive summer education program at Sphinx partner institutions in Chicago and in Ohio.
The Sphinx Performance Academy is a tuition-free summer music program for minority youth aged 12 to 17. They get instruction in private lessons and quartet playing, and it culminates in a final concert on the last day of each program.
Sphinx is more than just an organization promoting minorities in classical music. It's a movement, one being recognized by media outlets around the world. From the halls of the White House, where Sphinx founder Aaron Dworkin recently became President Barack Obama's appointee to the National Council on the Arts, to Sphinx laureate performances and partnerships abroad, the Sphinx Organization is being noticed.
In our first 15 years, we've been able to literally transform the lives of tens of thousands. And now, Sphinx Con is bringing together global leaders from across the performing arts sector and beyond as we empower ideas for diversity in the arts. But there is tremendous work that still needs to be done.
I'm just in awe of what Sphinx has accomplished, but even more excited about its future.
I am Sphinx.
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 So now that you have a sense of the work that Sphinx does, I want to kind of just give you a sense of this landscape that we all operate in. And then I'm very interested in getting into some questions. So to give you a sense just kind of arts and culture funding and all of that, because I wanted to, and it's interesting because what I usually like to do is just have the first graph and then I can unveil, I can reveal. But with these prezzies, I have to kind of put it all out there. So the very short note of it is that in terms of arts and culture funding, obviously the country of Germany spends about $11 billion. Just for the city of Berlin alone, they spend $680 million, and of course our budget for the NEA was pre-sequester, $155 million, but now of course has dropped from there. Now, we have a history of private philanthropy in the United States that does not exist to the same extent in Europe, and of course Europe is going through a transformation of arts funding because of the economic impact of things that have happened. But even when you take into account that private philanthropy, there is still, of course, a dramatic skew in terms of the investment, the public investment that we make in the arts. And as one of the things, one of my favorite quotes, is the idea that budgets are moral documents, and they do more than just assign and allocate funds, but they reflect the way that a society or an entity or an organization values various things. And so again, it's very important to look at percentage of GDP because that really gives you a sense of the relative value that a society publicly is placing on the arts. And so while Germany is at the top at 2%, a lot of Western countries are around 1%, France is 1%, Britain's at 0.8%, but we are not even at 0.1% or 100th, we're at 0.005% of GDP is what we spend on arts and culture. And keeping in mind that while our population is 300 million, the population of Berlin is 3.5 million. So it would be great, and for all of our organizations, wouldn't it be nice to have that public funding? Now, they are also experiencing the economic downturn much more acutely. A number of our dear partners in Europe are really, really suffering now because of the public cutbacks. This comes out of a study that Holly Sidford did. Some of you may be aware of it, the NCRP. But I wanted to share this because it talks about the disparity of funding in the arts, and specifically for underserved communities. So when we see total foundation giving in the arts, it's about 22 billion. Total foundation giving about 22 billion. Arts and culture is about 2.3 billion of that. Yes, believe it or not, there's $2.3 billion of funding out there. I'm not sure where it is. But we've been trying to find it at Sphinx. We're not finding it. But of that 2.3 billion, only about 200 million of that is focused on supporting underserved communities. And the very interesting thing that not only is that small portion focused on that, but when you identify arts-focused funders, which basically is defined as those where more than 25% of their grant making is in the arts, they actually give percentage-wise less to focus on underserved. So in other words, if you are an arts donor, you focus less on underserved communities than the general overall foundation community. So also I wanted to look at distribution. Now all of us kind of know big organizations get the big grants, but a lot of people aren't aware exactly to what extent that is a reality. So as you look at this graph and you see the 1.9%, that represents the percentage of arts organizations that have budgets more than $5 million. So less than 2% of all arts organizations have a budget of greater than $5 million. Yet, those 2% of organizations receive 55% of all of the funding. When you look at specifically the top 50 organizations alone in the entire arts spectrum of 100,000 arts organizations in the country, the top 50 alone, which represent 0.0005% of all arts organizations, those 50 organizations receive half of all of the funding. So yes, we know there's a disparity, but the disparity is unbelievably acute. And the study itself reached a couple conclusions where they stated this pronounced imbalance restricts the expressive life of millions of people, thus constraining our creativity as a nation. The asymmetry disadvantages all of us by restricting the types of cultural expressions we experience. And again, there's a lot more to this study, and there are those who have tried to attack it in some ways, and you can, attack any data, but the overall message of this, while you can maybe equate and associate some differential in numbers, nothing can overcome this stark disparity. And this is one of the things that I mentioned when I spoke at Sphinx Con, which is our national convening on diversity in the performing arts, or Amy was fantastic and that is Chimamanda Adichie, who's a famed Nigerian author who's fantastic. But she talks about, and she does a TED Talk, and she has amazing books, this danger of a single story. And one of the things that she says is, she says, the danger of a single story is not that it is untrue, but that it is incomplete. And I pose the question to us that, are we in the arts telling stories that are incomplete? And if so, I don't think we're fulfilling our role as artists to truly reflect our nation. And one of the last things I wanted to kind of share with you is to compare us to football. Why not? I like to, and I raise this for this reason, that we shouldn't compare ourselves to sports, obviously, in a host of different ways. But what I look at is the change and the difference. So what happened in 1979 is, of course, there have been huge, obviously, race and diversity issues across athletics over the course of the history of our country that have been addressed in a host of ways. But in 1979, they instituted the Rooney Rule, which actually came out of Pittsburgh and Pittsburgh Steelers and the owner at the time. And basically, it requires every single NFL team to interview, not hire, just interview at least one candidate of color for the general manager and or their head coach positions every year. And so what happened over the course of history is that once they did that, they went from about 6% of the head coaches being black in football to 22%. A transformational change just by requiring that one thing. The best kind of, in terms of just a time frame scenario I could draw in orchestras was 92 to 2008, where we went from 1.3% to 1.8%. So I raise that just to say that we should ask ourselves, why is it that in the field of the arts, we have no field-wide initiatives that address diversity? Not a single one. And this past year, when they actually went through and did this whole process, they had 7, I think, slots open for head coaches, 8 for general managers. They did not, in football, they did not hire a single person of color. The NFL commissioner came out and stated, this is unacceptable that we did this. And again, the question I would pose is, in the arts, where are our leaders' statements about the fact that our numbers are unacceptable. I'm unaware of them. And those types of aspects of leadership matter. The NFL is very serious about this. Detroit Lions, Sphinx's home base, was actually fined $200,000 for not following the Rooney Rule back in 2003. So whether it's sports, academia, business, our nation is filled with sectors that have looked at the issue of diversity and have instituted policies and initiatives to address it. There is a reason why we have been unsuccessful in this area. And while our results may be different, and while we may not want to have the exact 22% that there might be in football, et cetera, we certainly know that there needs to be a change. And until we bring about those initiatives, I fear we will not be successful. So in terms of the impact of Sphinx and looking at the work that we do over the past decade, Sphinx has really been at this forefront to try to make a difference. And I would share with you that as you look at the type of change that you need to make, it will not be easy. There's a reason why we have not done this as a field yet or not been successful. And in our history, we've had many challenges. And you may feel that kind of steel grip of fear when certain aspects and challenges arise. And I ask you to keep in mind the well-known quote that courage is not the absence of fear. It is action that is taken in the face of fear. And when you look at some of the impact that we've been able to have over our first 10 years, you can see that orchestras from 98 to 2008 actually doubled the number of African Americans in major orchestras. In every single instance where there was an increase, that person was an alum of a Sphinx program and or the orchestra was a partner of Sphinx. So we're beginning to have some type of impact on these numbers. Solo performances prior to Sphinx were rare. They now happen 20 to 30 times a year through our various orchestral partners. There, of course, was no Black or Latino orchestra. We have two, both our touring orchestra and the Sphinx Symphony, which assembles during the competition. Never in history was there a Black and Latino orchestra on tour. We now do a 15-city tour every fall. It was rare to hear classical music. We have 2 million in live and broadcast audiences every single year. There was relatively few commissions. We've had commissioning consortiums. We do commissions every single year and just launched our commissioner in residence for our Sphinx virtuosi. And it's important not only to look backward, but to also say, how are we investing in the future? And our Sphinx alumni have graduated to every single top 10 music school in the country. We obviously launched the first summer intensive program. We reached 85,000 students in over 200 schools and over 1.5 million that we feel we have invested in scholarship awards so that the next generation will be able to make a difference. And we are already seeing that through various alumni of ours who are not only carrying on their professional careers, but they are also launching initiatives of their own. Joseph Conyers, right here in Philadelphia, one of our alums and who's associate principal bass of the Philadelphia Orchestra, has his program Project 440 and also launched a community program in Savannah, Georgia, where he's from. Danielle Bellin, another one of our laureates and alums, launched Center Stage String out on the West Coast. And Angie Durrell, who's another one of our alums from our Sphinx Performance Academy, who is here with us today somewhere. If she can just stand so people can actually see her. Yep, there she is waving her hand. So recently and launched a program, as you can see, in Stanford, which focuses on engaging young immigrant students on their native instruments performing classical music and transforming their lives in that way. So we're able to do this, but this is just the beginning. And one of my fondest memories of Sphinx at Sphinx as I close is that I was in Atlanta for a Black Philanthropy Conference, and Coretta Scott King was speaking. And the Sphinx artist you see here, Patrice Jackson, had the opportunity to perform before Mrs. King. And the tears in her eyes were just incredibly powerful, and the words that she spoke to me after the performance were as well. And they resonated with the words in one of the well-known quotes of her husband, which really resonate, I think, the work that we are trying to do. And that is that change does not roll in on the wheels of inevitability, but comes through continuous struggle. And history will have to record that the greatest tragedy of this period was not the strident clamor of the bad people, but the appalling silence of the good people. And our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. And I submit to all of you that this work in diversity across all of our disciplines in the arts matters. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here with you for this exciting conference. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah.